Evening, everyone. Welcome to The Next Revolution, live from the swamp tonight. Yeah, I came to Washington, D.C. for the big dinner last night. I've definitely got some things to say about that. Although the smartest observation I cannot claim credit for, it was from our friend Katie Pavlich, who I was sitting with during Biden's speech. Thank you, Katie. We'll get to all that a bit later. As you may have seen, though, Biden made some actually pretty good jokes about his age last night. But how funny is it really? After that amazing statement we showed you last week from the White House that they're once again going to try and keep Biden off the campaign trail to avoid the risk of, quote, age-related mishaps, we saw their shifty scheme in action this week with Biden's pathetic campaign launch video. And then on Friday, another absolutely jaw-dropping statement from White House aides acknowledging what we can all see, that Biden is simply not capable of being president. Some White House officials say it's difficult to schedule public or private events with the president in the morning, in the evening, or on the weekends. Okay, then. Let's hope the next global crisis doesn't happen in the morning, the evening, or on a weekend. What's important about all this is not the humiliation of one feeble old man. It's what it reveals about the state of our system of government. The Democrats these days never stop lecturing everyone about our democracy. But how democratic is it to foist a non-president onto the country for 4 more years when 70% of Americans don't want him to run again, a majority of Democrats don't want him to run again, and the only people who really do want him to run again are his cynical handlers who love having a knackered, clapped-out, senile president because it means they stay in charge, and that is a fraud on the American people. And that question, who's really in charge, is our focus tonight. Because while it's obvious that our decrepit husk of a president is actually controlled by the people around him, the lack of real democratic accountability in the rest of our system, that's much less visible. That building behind me is full of the people you elect to make the laws you have to live by. But in reality, the real decisions are too often made by unelected legislative staffers, the legislature's version of the permanent administrative state here in Washington. We saw this most recently with Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman, who just spent weeks in hospital for clinical depression after he'd suffered a stroke which left him cognitively impaired. But somehow, while incapacitated in a hospital bed, Fetterman co-sponsored several Senate bills. So how's he able to do that? Well, his chief of staff gave a surprisingly honest answer to the Pennsylvania Capital Star last month, saying it was an interesting moment to look behind the scenes at how the Senate works. And that even if the senator were physically present, the staff would likely be doing the same amount of work negotiating and producing policy. Great. Pennsylvanians voted for Fetterman, but a bunch of staffers are actually producing policy. Even Jon Stewart recently pointed this out in an interview with CNN's Fareed Zakaria.
Our country is held together by hundreds of really talented legislative aides. Their bosses, many times, are wind-up dolls who really don't know. I mean, half of it, if you go down there, especially the Senate, is like an assisted living facility. So, it's held together by these legislative aides.
He calls it holding it together. We might use a different term. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi let us in on all this more than a decade ago when she let this one slip.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Turns out for once she wasn't lying. And the truth is, so much of the detail, the things that actually end up affecting your life, is put in by unelected legislative aides, especially on the committees where the real work gets done. These committee people, they're often permanent, outlasting the elected members of Congress. And guess what? Just like the rest of permanent Washington, they're the perfect target for the lobbyists and special interests. You see the evasion of democratic accountability at the state level, too. Here's the headline from a USA Today investigation a few years ago. You elected them to write new laws, they're letting corporations do it instead. Every year, state lawmakers introduce thousands of bills called model legislation. It's written by lobbyists. In the 8 years prior to USA Today's investigation, nearly 10,000 bills nationwide were entirely copied from model legislation. More than 2,000 of them eventually ended up being signed into law. You won't even believe what Democrats now do in my home state of California to evade democratic accountability. They pass blank bills, legislation with literally nothing in it. It goes through all the official processes of debate and scrutiny with nothing in it. they pass it, and then a year later, they amend it. But the amendment is the actual policy, only because the bill already went through the proper steps of public scrutiny when it was blank. This way, they don't have to bother with public scrutiny for the real substantive legislation. It is an obscene bastardization of the democratic process. This is how they sneaked in their latest climate extremism. California's scheme to charge for electricity based on income that we told you about last week. It was passed as a blank bill 2 years ago. And this is from the party that never stopped lecturing everyone about our democracy. The anti-democratic scheming and trickery is even worse in the executive branch. Once legislation is passed by Congress, the bureaucrats in the federal departments and agencies turn it into real-life rules. They literally call it rule-making. Look what they just did with the recent CHIPS Act. It was sold to us as a national security measure. Subsidies for semiconductor makers to manufacture in America so we're not reliant on China, or more especially Taiwan, in case China invades. But now, the bureaucrats writing the rules are using it to push all their pet left-wing policies, like forcing union labor rules onto the corporations getting the subsidies. Amazingly, Biden's Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, was completely open about it. Here she is. If Congress wasn't going to do what they should have done, we're going to do it in implementation. Oh, are you? How lovely. Why don't we just throw away the Constitution, stop having elections, and just let the Democrats, the unions, and their technocrat cronies decide everything, and then call it saving our democracy? Again, it's the same at the state level. In California, the ban on gas cars was made by an outfit called CARB, the unelected California Air Resources Board. In every state, everywhere you look, many of the actual policies that affect your life, your business, your community, it's decided by unelected bureaucrats, and you have no clue who they are or what they do. But when we ask who's really in charge, of course we mustn't leave out the donors. In Congress, Wall Street funds every single member of the Financial Services Committee that's supposed to regulate Wall Street. Big Agriculture funds the Agriculture Committee. Big Pharma funds the Health Committee. On and on it goes, the swampy circle of legalized corruption. Biden just put a doctor onto the federal government's Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee who claimed that diet and lack of exercise aren't the cause of obesity. Instead, she thinks the answer is drugs for life.
And these medications really spend their time acting primarily on the brain to upregulate one of the pathways that tells us to eat less and store less, while down-regulating a pathway that tells us to eat more and store more.
So people who do have the disease of obesity, if they are taking these medications, do they take them for life? Is that correct?
Yes, that is.
Now, why would a doctor say something like that? Oh, look, Big Pharma paid that doctor over $30,000 in 2021, including $15,000 from Novo Nordisk, who just so happened to be the manufacturers of one of the nation's main weight loss drugs. So, Big Sugar pays to give us unhealthy diets, Big Pharma pays to medicalize it all, and Wall Street pays to keep the whole rotten show on the road. And we haven't even talked about the most pernicious, corrupt special interest of all, the government unions, who own the Democratic Party, pushing it further and further to the left, keeping our schools closed in the pandemic, pocketing luxury pensions and healthcare in exchange for donations and activism. Yeah, our democracy is at risk. And right now it's mainly at risk from Democrats who are making a mockery of it. Here's the New York Times this week. Strange as it may sound, the American government can function without a healthy president. White House aides, cabinet secretaries and military leaders performed well, despite the lack of a fully engaged leader. It is all completely unacceptable. We've got to stop this smoke and mirrors charade. We've got to end the shameless corruption. And perhaps above all, we've got to elect anti-system candidates who will get it all done. That's the next revolution we need. Tell us what you think on the new free Twitter at NextRevFNC and at Steve Hilton X, and share this message when we post it. Joining us now, 2024 presidential candidate, biotech entrepreneur and author of Capitalist Punishment, How Wall Street is Using Your Money to Create a Country You Didn't Vote For. Of course, Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek, great to see you. I think we might describe you as an anti-system candidate. Would you accept that characterization?
Wholeheartedly, Steve. That's exactly what I am. It's an outsider that needs to come in and gut that managerial bureaucracy that actually runs the show today. You nailed it in that monologue.
And so let's just look at all the different aspects of it, because every time you poke at one of these pieces or pull on the thread, whatever analogy you want to use, there are some objections that are always thrown up. So, for example, let's look at the donor part of it. So, well, in a free country, people who run businesses and own them and so on should be able to make political donations. You don't want to ban that. What's the way through that argument?
Well, look, I actually think there's an opportunity for Republicans to become the party that wants to keep big money out of politics, not by changing any laws, but by making that a norm in our party. This used to be a left-wing cry to say they want to keep big money out of politics. Well, if Republicans, even in the primary, say that we don't want super PACs playing a big role, then we go to the general election, we actually have a bigger hand. But, Steve, I think the bigger problem today is the one you put your finger on. There is a waterfall of political accountability. It starts where we have a three-part system of government, legislative, executive, and judicial in the Constitution. That's not how it works. It delegates that authority to an alphabet soup of the FDA to FTC to SEC to God knows what. But now there's a third move. That waterfall is now kicking down to the private sector's alphabet soup of FB, GOOG, BLK, that's BlackRock's ticker. That's actually what's happening is we're delegating power, political power, further and further away from where the Constitution invested it. And I think that that's what we need to restore. Where, look, I have this dream as a citizen, Steve. It's a radical dream, the same one that our founding fathers had, that the people who we elect to run the government ought to be the ones who actually run the government. That isn't the case today. I'm going to come in and fix it.
Tell us about your book, Vivek, because it's very much connected to all of this, because the arguments you've been making, and especially in this new one, go right to the heart of how it's not the people we elect that make the decisions that end up affecting us.
Right. I mean, we fought a revolution in this country in 1776 to say that for better or worse, it was the citizens of a nation that determined how to sort out our social and political differences. The old world Europe model was they did it in the back of palace halls. Well, what happened today is those palace halls are the back corner office of a BlackRock office on Park Avenue in Manhattan, where government actors are deputizing those ESG fund managers or ESG promoting asset managers to do through the back door what government could have never done through the front door under the Constitution. Climate change agendas, emissions caps, racial equity caps at places like Apple or Home Depot or Chevron, using the money of everyday citizens to do it. That's a betrayal, Steve, of both capitalism and democracy. And I think the right answer is to say that no matter what you think about climate change or racial equity, we should want to sort that out through the political system where every person's voice and vote counts equally. That used to be a left-wing cry. I think that can be a calling card for the conservative movement today.
Well said. Thank you, Vivek. The book is called Capitalist Punishment. Good luck with that and with your campaign. We'll see you soon. All right, here with more, the editor-at-large for The Spectator, Ben Domenech, and the editor-in-chief of The Federalist, Molly Hemingway, both are Fox News contributors. I'm going to call you swamp experts in the sense of being outsiders who observe all this madness. And see all this that goes on. I'm here just visiting. You're here the whole time. So let's just get into it. Molly, I mean, it just seems to me that when it's so accepted that this is how it all works, but it's totally outrageous. And the Democrats who lecture us about democracy seem to be completely fine with it. In fact, they're making it worse.
Well, one of the big problems is that Washington, D.C. benefits so mightily from this system. Everyone here is actually doing really well. There's almost an inverse relationship. When things are bad for the country, things are good in D.C.
Right.
When people are unhappy, things are good in D.C. And it means that they don't have a huge incentive. But you laid it out well, the complexity and why these things are so difficult to change.
Well, the actual indictment I would have is of Republicans, because if you look back historically over the last 25 to 30 years, since Ronald Reagan and H.W. Bush, George W. Bush and Donald Trump actually both increased the size of the bureaucracy in Washington. There's 2 million, a little bit more than 2 million federal bureaucrats in the Washington, D.C. area. They run your lives. That's not including, by the way, any military, any postal service, any contractors,
that's
or
kind
anything
of policy
like.
making.
Those are all of these different folks. And the fact is that when a president comes in, you have this assumption that the government is now going to work according to his wishes, but that's not the way this happens at all. In fact, all of those swamp creatures, all of those bureaucrats, they immediately have the mindset of, I am going to wait until this president is gone. I'm going to try to slow my roll on implementing any policy. And eventually I'll get back to doing the things that I want, which are, of course, leftist in nature.
By the way, that's just it's the same in the UK when I was in the government there. I remember going to see Tony Blair, but before we went into 10 Downing Street, it was clear that David Cameron, my boss, was going to be the Prime Minister, asked for his advice. And Tony Blair said exactly that. He said, you've got to understand, because he learnt it too late. And these civil servants, the bureaucracy, said they see it as their patriotic duty to stop what you're doing and to wait you out. But Trump, I think, Molly, did understand that. I mean, he's very frustrated by it. And so we're hearing from his campaign a lot of focus on this. Schedule F, this measure that I think will enable them to get rid of many more of the people that Ben's talking about. What do you think about all that?
So it's absolutely amazing how difficult it is to fire anyone in the federal government. When I was a much younger reporter, I looked at every cabinet-level agency. We're talking about agencies with tens of thousands, or in some cases, hundreds of thousands of employees who had not fired a single person for cause in years. Unheard of in the private sector. And it's a culture, but there are also all sorts of rules and regulations that make it almost impossible. You have to actually do something like this Schedule F change. But you also just need a culture that accepts that, of course, in a democratic republic like ours, you need accountability. And the person who you elect as president needs to have the power to manage that workforce.
Yes, exactly. And to implement the actual policies that they were elected on. I mean, it's just sort of outrageous that they even think it's. What I find amazing about it is the shamelessness of it. That they think it's perfectly okay to sort of, and they brag about stopping when Trump was there. They bragged about trying to stop him. And Ben, now with Biden, there's like that New York Times piece. They're going to brag about the fact that we don't really need a president because we run it anyway.
Yeah, keep in mind the context of this, which is that 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, you have the Wilson administration basically saying we need to have this administrative state in order to insulate all these decisions from corrupt politics. We're going to give it to top men. We're going to decide all these things for us. And now we are left with a situation where Schedule F is an approach, the brainchild of Russ Vought, who's a very smart policy actor, both on Capitol Hill and then in the OMB under Trump, who basically said, we want to be able to fire about 50,000 people and replace them. And the Washington Post reacted as if this was a fascist declaration of authoritarianism in America. They freaked out because all of those people subscribe to the Washington Post, and they're very angry about it.
Exactly. just to end with Biden, Molly. I mean, that amazing quote from the White House aides that Biden can't do anything in public or private in the morning, the evening, or at weekends. Do they realize when people hear that, how outraged they are?
Well, it's a horrible thing to hear, but it's also sort of an indication that Joe Biden is not who's running the country.
Yeah.
And so much work gets done during those days and hours because other people are actually doing it.
Who do you think it is? I mean, just a very quick last question, because you hear a lot, Susan Rice. The name that's always mentioned, Susan Rice is running, and she's out now. I mean, who are these people? Who are the people who you think are really...
It might as well be a ham sandwich, Steve. That's really true, unfortunately. It's a ham and cheese sandwich just sitting there waiting for other staff.
I suppose the answer comes back to what I was talking about. It's all this system. The kind of aggregation of all of it. And that's why that's why focusing on changing the system is really important. Great to see you both. We'll see you both later in the show.
Thank you.
All right, that's it for the moment. We'll be right back.